What the hell are we gonna do now? I'm totally screwed. I don't have time to be walking from the woods right now.
Welcome to part 4, our final part on this tutorial series. Today we'll talk about some lighting and rendering tips, but please check out our other videos because there's a lot to get into. Okay, so I'm going to give you a quick overview of some lighting and rendering tips. It's certainly not an in-depth session here, and so I encourage you to check out some of the other videos because there's quite a few good tips and tricks that we've already recorded. But I'm going to walk you through a few things specifically to this scene, and hopefully it helps you along your way. So the first thing you want to know is up here we have different render modes, and I'm in path trace right now, but you can of course pick real time or iRay. And really the difference here is real time, while it's ray traced, is optimized for speed. And as you can see here, a few of the little details have sort of dropped off, but in general it looks amazing. You still get good reflections and everything. If I switch to path traced here, you can notice a little bit more fidelity, of course, and it looks a little bit better. Now that said, I am kind of cheating because I did add path traced fog here. So if I turn that off, the difference between real time and path traced is just a slight better fidelity around some of the shadows and some of the surfaces, but in general it's pretty much bang on. In fact, if you just look at his chest, for instance, and not necessarily some of the fancier subsurface and stuff we're doing, it looks almost exactly the same. And then if you switch to iRay, it becomes even better, sort of the gold standard of rendering. And so what we're going to talk about today is we're going to focus on real-time and path tracing. And in fact, I'm actually going to spend most of my time on path tracing just so we can push this to like that cinematic level that you would expect from a feature film. And so the first thing I'm going to talk about is some of the lighting setup that I've done, and then we'll get into some of these settings. With that said, when you look at the default setting here, so if I pick path traced and I look in my render settings, I've got the similar setup here where I've got real-time and path trace, and these settings are specific to each of them. So if you come to path trace, the defaults are, fairly low as far as trying to give you some nice speed when you're rendering. So if I'm moving around, you can see it renders super fast, which is nice. But if you want to then sort of push it a little bit more and start trying to really get some more looks, like if we want to add like some nice shine to his eyes and different things and really force things, you're going to want more max bounces and different settings here. So for instance, if I bring this up to like a 10 and a 10 and maybe the volume we want to have like a 50 or something higher, we can start seeing a little bit more fidelity. But the total samples is also important here. So it will show the count up here, but this will allow you how many before it stops, right? And so if I take this from 10 to 200, for instance, you start noticing a big difference as far as it really starting to refine. So for instance, the eye looks a lot better, the subsurface around his mouth looks a lot better. And that really is because we've got denoising going on in the background. So if I turn that off, you can see all the little noise bits that are denoiser actually really great about getting rid of. And so if I drop this from 200 back to 10, you can see the difference of quality as far as what we were able to render within 10 samples per pixel, and then what the denoiser is actually able to turn that into, which is pretty nice. But if you crank this up a bit, so again, if I do 200, let's say, you're just going to get finer details everywhere, which will allow the denoiser to do a better job, and so you won't feel as painterly, if you will. And the scattering and volume type stuff is especially important if you're starting to use some of this path trace fog. So in this setting, I've got a path trace fog with some bounces and a slight bit of purple in it, and that just sort of fills in the background and makes the horse stand out a bit. Now you can notice I've already got a light selected here, but obviously purple contrasts with orange, and so what I've tried to do is fill the front of the horse a little bit with some orange, just a little bit, nothing crazy, but enough that it sort of jumps off the background a bit more. And so let's talk a little bit about the lighting and how I did that. So you can see we've got different types of lights in here. First, we've got rectangle lights, we've got a distance light, and different ones. Let's talk quickly about the background first, and then we'll get into the details of the actual horse. So I'm going to jump to a different camera here so you can see, and let's go ahead and turn off that fog so you can see a bit better. So what I've done in the background here is I've put a picture, right? And it's a dome light, so anywhere I look, well, if I'm not looking into the ground, but if I go up here and anywhere I look, you can see I've got different lights. And so there's a giant light up here, but in general, most of the background is this sphere or dome. And you can easily create one of your own in a couple different ways. One, we've got the Sky browser with a bunch of really nice ones set up already for you, and you can just click and pick one. Or the second way, what I've done here is I've got the Sky Dome, and it's a dome light. So I just simply create in the lights a dome light, which makes this, and then you can play with the color and you can play with a texture. So I gave it a texture file here, which is basically a picture from the local forest that we walk in. So I walk my dog up this trail, and I just thought, hey, why don't I take a 360 photo? And that's what we're using in the background. So because the forest and everything is all filled in, really all I care about is something soft. The quality of the photo doesn't even have to be that great. I'm mostly using it to cast some nice reflections and shadows, and so when you see it on the ground, it makes sense, and then you sort of start seeing little subtle bits of that within his armor. You can start seeing the forest reflecting as you would expect, right? But you can see some purples and some blues and some other colors in his armor, and that's because I wanted to be a bit more fancy than just having a photo. And you can see, like, even looking at him from here, like it looks really nice. And not only the armor, but his, a little bit of action going on in his eyes and his face, even though for the most part, this shot, he's not even in camera, so I didn't really care too much about him being lit too well. I just wanted to make sure his armor looked nice. So let's jump to the lights. So what I did was with the dome light, I got the background going, and then I put in a sunlight here. So I'm going to turn off all the other lights so you can see what we've done. So this is everything off, right? And this is just the sun. So if I turn off the dome light, you can see what I'm doing is using the sunlight to sort of act like a really soft light coming through the trees. And it's nothing more than just a nice blue color to sort of balance out some of the other colors that we've got going on. So if I turn back on the dome light, what you get is sort of this filled in look to the knight and the horse, but it's still pretty dark. And so then what I'm going to do from the camera is start working on filling in the horse, both from the side and the front, and that's literally what I start calling them. So if I look at the side fill here, this is actually the side of the horse. So not necessarily properly named if you're thinking from camera terms, but basically I've got this giant rectangle light here that's acting like a giant soft light, soft box kind of light that's filling in the horse. And so while this color's here and this intensity is cranked up, if we sort of scroll down here a bit and we look, there's a tab called shaping. And what shaping does is allow you to sort of add quite a bit of edge to your light. So if no shaping, it's going to be a much harsher light. So if you look at the ground here and we take the focus down to 0, you can see the difference, right? So it's a very harsh orange light, but if I add some nice sort of soft edges of a blue, basically it acts like a soft light that you'd expect, which is quite nice. And that's a trick that they'll use in real photography all the time, is trying to get the light not to be harsh, but to still be there. And they soften it out with different cutters and filters and stuff that they put in front of it, soft boxes, etc. And really that's what I'm trying to mimic here, is a giant softbox kind of light that he's filled in so that you get some nice shadows going on in his legs, but nothing crazy. Now, if I look back from the camera, the horse is starting to look good, and it's already just, again, we've got the sun and the sky dome in the background and the side view. So the next thing I want to do is sort of fill in his front, because the horse is feeling kind of dark still. And so what I did was I wanted to add a bit more interest to it. So I went with a pink light. So I turned that on. And it's, again, very subtle, but you just get a little bit of pink in his neck here. And you start seeing a little bit of pink in the armor. Now, I didn't want too much pink in the armor because that might have felt a bit weird. And you can see his teeth are starting to go pink. But in general, what we wanted to do is, again, just sort of fill in some stuff to get some nice lighting going on. And it's important to look at it from different angles and different spots within the shot. And you can see maybe there's a bit too much pink, then you can dial it down, but this neck kind of looks nice, but in his armor, maybe not. And so the next thing you want to do is just keep working on some of these things. So the last light I sort of thought to myself was the background felt really dark. So I put his giant big light in the background just to sort of fill that in. So you can see the difference here. And again, this is the same tricks. This is a giant blue light in this case. I've got some shaping going on again, just to sort of softly fill in the background. But you can notice that it's still kind of green and kind of dark. And that's because all of these things sort of have to be balanced out as you go with all of the total effect. So remember I had fog in before, so let's turn that fog back on. And you can see that really rounds out into more of a blue color versus the green that it was. And it's starting to feel a lot better. Now the last thing I'll talk about in the lighting is we added this eye glint. So you can see his eyes here. In fact, let's get to a shot maybe about here where you see his horse's eyes really big, right? But it feels kind of dead. And one of the classical things that you'll see in movies like from Disney, etc., is like the little eye highlight. And so what we did was take a sphere light, which is just a round ball of a light, and put that and positioned it such that it would show up just in his eye. And you can notice it does hit his armor here as well, but that's okay. It feels pretty good and actually fills in that pink that we were worried about so that armor doesn't feel so pink. And the nice bonus is the way I've set up this sphere light is that the horse kind of fills in just a little bit more and feels again a bit more white, which is pretty nice. And so now it's starting to feel pretty good. The next thing I want to do from a lighting perspective is get it in a decent spot like this, and then you want to start playing with some of the settings in the render settings. So let's take a look here. Under render settings, again, you can increase the samples and all the rest of it as we talked about. And you might even want to do that when you render your final one. You might even want to do 400 or something. Really depends on the quality that you're trying to do. In fact, 400 is probably over rendering this. I really don't need that much. But in some scenarios, I might need 2000. It really depends on what you're working on. But the last tab we haven't talked about is this post-processing tab. And this is where it gets really fun. So if we go, let's take this back down to like 250 because I don't think we necessarily need a crazy amount of samples here. But if I look in the post-processing tab, we have a number of really cool things to play with. And you can see I've got a few turned on already. So I've got bloom going on, color grading, color correction, there's exposure, and a bunch of different things you can do. So let's look at the bloom first. And what I've done here is basically added just a little tiny bit of bloom, and there's different settings here, and you'll want to play with it depending on your scene and what you're trying to do. But really what I was trying to do is just sort of get the light to catch just a little bit, nothing crazy, but let's turn it on and off and see the difference. So this is with it off, and this is with it on. Off, on, right? So it's very subtle, but it makes the armor feel just a little bit more cartoony and popping out a little bit. Again, off and on. And if I did something a lot stronger, so this is 0.15, if I did like 1, you can really see like the whole horse blows out and everything. Didn't necessarily want that, but I did want a little bit of it to feel just a bit magical and soft. So I didn't want 0. And I ended up in this range, and you could probably push it a little bit further, maybe here. You have to be careful with bloom though, because it'll start making things feel too soft. So bloom's a fun one to play with. I'll put it back to what I had it at. The other interesting one is we've got color grading and color correction. So these are a lot of fun because you can really change the look and the feel of the image. So if I turn both of these off, you can see it feels pretty similar to where I ended up with my lighting. But as I was grading and correcting it, if I graded it, it went really pink, just to try to bring up some of the life in the horse and force it in the direction that the animator wanted, and a bit more, like I said, a feature film cartoon kind of feel. And that felt a little bit too far, so then I used the color correction to just sort of knock it down a little bit with a bit more contrast and stuff. And you could argue that maybe I push it here or there, and again, you can mess with all sorts of things and do crazy looks if you want to go really extreme, or not, right? And so what's nice with this is a little blue box you can click, and that will set it back to the default, and you can really change the look of things. So this is looking pretty good. Let me just give you a quick view of where I put these lights. So again, the sphere light is here to catch the glint in his eye, and it's kind of positioned carefully to make sure it catches where I want it to. The sunlight is just off in the distance as a giant distant light. The front fill we talked about already is just in the front. You can see this pink soft light shining forward, and it's positioned far enough away that it doesn't get overwhelming. And then the background fill again is just this giant softbox that I've put to fill in the forest, and you can see it's built to fill in the forest back here and not really interact with anything that we'll be seeing in the camera as far as the foreground and the characters and stuff. Okay, with that sort of layout, let me open up the other scene and you can see what we did in the second shot. Okay, so in the second shot it's nice because it's a bit different requirements here. In fact, the horse and everybody are quite a bit smaller on camera, and as they cross the screen, there's quite a bit of action and stuff going on where we've got some foreground elements that we want to be blurry, which we talked about the depth of field before, so you can dial that in. In fact, if we look at the camera again, if you go to our depth of field camera here, one of the nice tricks to do is to sort of take the f-stop and put it really small. So let's go with like a 0.1 or something. Well, maybe maybe that's too small, but like a 2-ish, and you can start seeing what's super clear and what isn't, right? And so in this case, you can see about 105 is what I've settled on, but throughout the scene, how do we keep the horse sort of feeling in focus and everything else out of focus? Now, obviously, even the horse is still out of focus with a 2, but it gives you that setting of this look starts feeling really nice as far as the night and stuff jumping out from the background. And that's really the whole point of this depth of field, is to really, if you take your f-stop down, dial in basically think of it as a sphere of influence from the camera, both in front and behind. And then as you grow your f-stop, that sphere gets bigger, right? So more things will be in focus. So if I take this to a 20, more things are in focus there. And I don't remember the final setting. I think I was sitting at a 24, but something around that range where he and the horse start feeling in focus, but everything else is just a little bit softer in the background, especially the foreground elements. The difference from a lighting perspective than from our last scene, if we look from a perspective angle, is there's a few things, right? So we've got same kind of setup where the horse is walking in one direction. So I went with a side fill and a front fill, and I tried to keep them very similar to what we had from before. So again, I'm talking front from the horse's perspective. It just made sense in my head when I was doing the light. In this case, this front light is pretty far off, so I had to crank up some intensity and stuff. But again, I wanted to have that sort of soft feel, and you can feel how this forest is soft there. The side fill, I wanted to have one sort of where he is and then another one in action as they're walking, so that it didn't feel like one giant light throughout the whole scene and it felt different. And so I added a second fill, which is basically very similar. And then to give it even more interest, what I did was down here, I added a texture file. So I added a texture of, and if I look at that one, it's just like a little bit of forest kind of stripes of trees and stuff. But that way we get some nice sort of stripy kind of shadow action happening from the light rather than just straight up one big blocky light. And again, it's using the soft shaping, so it's super soft around the edges here, as you can see, and not necessarily in your face. And then basically the rest of it, the sun and the background fill are very similar to what we talked about last time. So that all makes sense, and we've sort of fill in the trees here, and you can see. Um, Now the other thing you'll notice is that because of the way the horse is set up, I have him so far off camera and the night off camera that I got rid of that eye glint, because there was no real point. You wouldn't necessarily see it from this far back. Now you could argue I could put one in here. I didn't really feel like it was necessary. And then the last thing we'll talk about is obviously there's a bit more color going on in the night and things are going pretty well. And so I tweaked some of the skin surface shader. So again, as you look at the skin surface that we put in here, it's actually a pretty nice set by default. But one of the things I messed with the subsurface is really trying to push up some of the dark red a little bit, just to sort of get a little bit of action going on in his ears and stuff, nothing crazy. And then the other thing I did was really played with the scale until it was working where I thought it was in a good spot. And the other subtle thing that I did was I actually added subsurface stuff to the tail and the mane. And it felt like this looked a little bit better in this shot. And I wish I should have gone back to the first shot to fix that. But it just feels a little bit more alive and not necessarily as metallic. So I just added a little bit there. And again, if I look at the subsurface of the mane here, um, it's actually interesting where I have the default color of brown, but then I started trying to push it towards this purple, so I ended up using this sort of blue with about 0.4 in the subsurface to sort of force it that direction. And then I added a coat level. So if I look at the coat and I turn this on and off, this is really the difference that we talked about. And so it's a fun little thing to play with, but coat really is meant to be a clear coat for cars. And so what I did was, this is a little bit too white as far as I was trying to put. And so if I added some purple back, um, it just gives you a nice sheen look to it. And you could obviously mess with the number and do half of that or whatever you felt was the right setting. But it's an interesting one to play with, is that you can use clear coat, and sheen is another one, to really sort of add some detail and subtlety to what you're trying to do. So again, lighting is not necessarily just lighting. You're kind of tweaking but all these different things. And in this case, the render setting, because it's a bit further away and I wanted a bit more of the fog action, I actually have the volume scattering up a fair bit, as you can see here. And when I went to render the final movie, I was sitting at 500. And so again, you can see the render time here. The difference is really like 500 is going to probably take it, we can let it finish, but roughly it looks about 30-40 seconds a frame. And it really depends on if that's too much or not. It probably is. You could probably drop that to 200 or somewhere in between. The interesting thing that I do is you can turn off the denoiser here and really see at what point is it enough detail that you think the denoiser is doing its job. And in this case, if I turn the denoiser blend factor up a little bit, you can actually force it to not do denoising everywhere. And so it's a really nice thing to sort of play with, turn this off, look at it, and then sort of play with the blend factor and get it to a point where you're happy. Now, the last thing you need to do when you're ready to render is actually save these things out. And so again, there's tutorials on all these things, but if you go under render movie capture, there's a number of different things here. Again, what you want to do is give it a name, the frame range. In this case, we're looking at from 100 to 220, and the resolution. I did a 4K resolution. You can then switch to path traced if that's what you're using. And then here's some sample settings again where you can start looking at how many per frame or subframe are you doing? And this is where you dial in your motion blur as well. And so in this case, I had a smaller motion blur. I think I was at 0.22, and then I wanted the sub samples to come up quite a bit for the motion blur. And I had to play with different settings until I was happy, but I think I was sitting around a 20. And this will be different per scene, per action, what's going on. In this case, I didn't want to get too soft, so again, I messed with a lot of variations. You might be down around 10 or somewhere in between. And depending on what you're using here, you're going to want to change settings here. So it's not like one number is going to fit all, but these are definitely the combo of two things you want to try with. So give it a name, hit capture sequence, and you're done. It's going to spit it out and it's good to go. Now, the other interesting thing is you can actually pick MP4 if you want to. It will still save out a folder of your image as an image sequence, but it also combine it as an MP4 just as a nice thing for you at the end. So yeah, movie capture is really straightforward. It's really quick. You can see here, even when I crank it up, it's 30 seconds a frame. It's not terrible. It's actually really fast. You can, of course, if I drop this down to like 100 and I had my denoising on, I'm looking at maybe something like 7 seconds a frame. Yeah, not even. So it really depends on what you're trying to do. And honestly, that's looking pretty good already. So hopefully that's a good little overview for you. There's a number of different settings that we didn't talk about. Like you can mess with the bloom as I talked about, but even in this TV noise area, you can actually turn on a vignette. So you can see there's a bunch of noise here. I can turn off the film grain itself and really play with the vignette how much I want and then really dial it back. It's an interesting way to sort of give a bit of life in the center. Like that might have actually been really cool. I felt like it was blowing the horse out just a little bit too much, but you can easily do a bunch of really cool things there. So if, again, on and off, just depends what you want to do. And then I'm not even talking about reshade. There's a whole menu of different things in there to give it different looks. There's a lot of different things you can do in Omniverse and have fun. Hopefully there's a few good tips. Definitely experiment and hit us up on the forums if you got questions. All right, have a great time. Thanks.